You think you can play piano, boy? Go ahead, entertain us. These were the cruel words that would change everything at an exclusive charity gala where wealth and privilege ruled supreme. When 14-year-old Marcus accidentally wandered into a world he didn't belong to, he never expected to face the mockery of renowned pianist Richard Steinberg and socialite Victoria Ashford. What started as a humiliating joke in front of cameras and sneering elite guests would become a moment that shocked everyone in that room. But what hidden talent did this young boy possess that would turn the tables completely? What happened next defied every expectation and left a Grammy-winning pianist speechless. Dear viewer, if you are watching my story for the first time, I humbly request you write the location from where you are watching right now, subscribe this channel and press the bell icon now not to miss the notifications of my daily published news stories. Thank you, and let's dive into the full story. Marcus Johnson pressed his fingers against the worn plastic keys of his grandmother's old Casio keyboard, the sound barely audible through the thin apartment walls. At 14, he had calluses on his fingertips from hours of practice on keys that sometimes stuck and notes that sounded more like electronic beeps than music. The small apartment in East Oakland wasn't much, but it was home, and this corner by the window was his sanctuary. Marcus, baby, you've been at that thing for 3 hours, his grandmother, Dorothy, called from the kitchen where she was preparing their simple dinner. Her voice carried the exhaustion of someone who worked double shifts at the hospital cafeteria just to keep their heads above water. Just a little longer, Grandma, Marcus replied softly, his eyes focused on the sheet music he'd printed from the library computer. The pages were worn from constant handling, some taped together where they'd torn. He was working through a Bach invention, one that he'd watched countless times on YouTube, slowing down the video to catch every finger movement. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, her uniform still on from her long day. She watched her grandson with a mixture of pride and worry. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 7, leaving her to raise him on her meager income. She'd seen his passion for music grow over the years, but she also knew the reality of their situation. You know, I believe in your dreams, honey, she said gently, sitting on the edge of his bed. But you also need to think about practical things. Maybe we should look into that apprenticeship program at the community center. Marcus's fingers stilled on the keys. He understood what she was really saying, that dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. Piano lessons cost money they didn't have. A real piano was impossible. Even the community college music program required fees that might as well have been $1 million. I know, Grandma, he said quietly. But when I play, it feels like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Dorothy's heart ached watching him. She'd sacrificed so much already, working extra shifts, skipping meals, wearing clothes until they fell apart, all so Marcus could have school supplies and the basics he needed. But music lessons, a real instrument, the kind of training that could nurture his obvious talent. It felt impossible. Maybe someday, she whispered, kissing the top of his head. Maybe someday. That night, after his grandmother had gone to bed, Marcus put on his headphones and continued practicing. He discovered that if he played very softly and used the headphone jack, he could practice without disturbing anyone. He pulled up another video, a performance of Chopin's Minute Waltz by a famous pianist. The man's fingers flew across the keys with such elegance and power that Marcus felt his chest tighten with longing. He began to mimic the movements, his plastic keys clicking softly under his fingers. In his mind, he could hear the real notes, the way they should sound. He imagined himself on a stage, at a real grand piano, with an audience that appreciated the music instead of complaining about noise. The apartment was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic and the soft clicking of his practice. Marcus closed his eyes and let muscle memory take over, his fingers finding the patterns he'd memorized through countless repetitions. Even on this broken instrument, something beautiful was happening. Something that his grandmother's practical concerns couldn't diminish, something that poverty couldn't steal away. Tomorrow would bring another day of school, another day of watching classmates talk about their piano lessons and music camps, another day of pretending he didn't care about things he couldn't have. But tonight, in this small room with his second-hand keyboard, Marcus was exactly where he belonged. The Ashford mansion in Pacific Heights gleamed under the setting sun, its pristine white columns and manicured gardens a testament to old money and older attitudes. Victoria Ashford stood in her marble foyer, directing the catering staff with the precision of a military commander. Tonight's charity gala would raise funds for underprivileged youth, though none of those youth would actually be in attendance. The champagne flutes go on the east terrace, not the west, Victoria snapped at a young server who immediately scurried to correct the mistake. She smoothed down her designer gown, a creation that cost more than most families made in a year. At 49, Victoria had perfected the art of looking down on people, both literally and figuratively. The evening's entertainment would be provided by Richard Steinberg, the renowned classical pianist whose performances graced the world's most prestigious concert halls. Victoria had paid his substantial fee without blinking, having Richard perform at her gala was a status symbol worth every penny. Richard arrived precisely at 7, his silver hair perfectly styled and his tuxedo impeccable. He carried himself with the bearing of someone who had never been told no, and who expected the world to arrange itself around his convenience. His handshake with Victoria was brief but cordial, two members of the elite acknowledging each other's position in the social hierarchy. "The Steinway is positioned exactly as you requested," Victoria informed him, gesturing toward the grand piano that dominated her living room. The instrument was worth more than most people's homes, a showpiece that she'd purchased more for its appearance than its sound. Richard ran his fingers over the keys experimentally, nodding his approval. "Adequate," he pronounced, though privately he considered the piano wasted on someone who viewed it as furniture rather than art. Still, the fee was generous, and these wealthy dilettantes served their purpose in maintaining his lifestyle. Guests began arriving at 8, a carefully curated collection of tech moguls, real estate developers, and society wives who competed to see who could spend the most on charity while doing the least actual charitable work. They air-kissed and exchanged pleasantries, their conversations a symphony of name-dropping and humble bragging. "Richard, darling," gushed Helena Worthington, a woman whose husband had made billions in tech and who now spent her time collecting artists like trophies. "I heard your performance at Carnegie Hall was absolutely transcendent." Richard smiled his practiced smile, the one that conveyed both gratitude and superiority. "Music has a way of elevating us above the mundane concerns of daily life," he replied, his tone suggesting that those mundane concerns were for lesser people. Victoria clinked her champagne glass, calling for attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, before our distinguished artist performs, I'd like to remind you why we're here tonight. We're raising funds to provide opportunities for disadvantaged children, to help them rise above their circumstances and perhaps, with enough guidance, become productive members of society." The crowd murmured approval, their consciences assuaged by writing checks that represented pocket change to them. None questioned whether throwing money at the problem while maintaining the systems that created it was actually helpful. None wondered if the disadvantaged children might have talents and dreams that their charity couldn't begin to address. Richard took his place at the piano, his posture perfect, his expression serious. He was about to begin when a commotion near the entrance caught his attention. Security guards were speaking in hushed, urgent tones to someone just outside the main room. "What's that about?" Helena whispered to Victoria. Victoria's expression hardened. "Probably some delivery person who got confused about which entrance to use. Don't worry, they'll handle it." But Richard found his attention drawn to the disturbance. In his world of carefully orchestrated performances and predetermined outcomes, unexpected elements were unwelcome. He preferred his audiences appreciative, educated, and properly dressed. Whatever was happening at the entrance represented the kind of chaos that didn't belong in his refined sphere. "Shall I begin?" he asked Victoria, his fingers poised over the keys. "Of course," she replied, but her attention was also drifting toward the entrance. "Though perhaps we should address that situation first." The evening that had begun so predictably was about to take a turn that none of them could anticipate. Marcus Johnson stood at the service entrance of the Ashford mansion, his grandmother's work uniform folded neatly in the delivery bag he carried. Dorothy had been asked to cover an extra shift at a private catering event, but when she'd fallen ill that afternoon, Marcus had volunteered to deliver her uniform to the replacement worker. The address had led him to this imposing mansion, but now he wasn't sure he was in the right place. The security guard who answered the door looked him up and down with undisguised suspicion. Marcus wore his best clothes, clean jeans and a button-down shirt his grandmother had bought him for school presentations, but in this setting, he might as well have been wearing rags. "What are you doing here, kid?" the guard asked, his hand instinctively moving to his radio. "I'm looking for Maria Gonzalez," Marcus explained politely. "My grandmother was supposed to work tonight, but she's sick, so I'm bringing the uniform for the replacement worker." The guard's expression didn't soften. "You sure you have the right address? This is a private event." Before Marcus could respond, he heard something that made his heart stop, the faint sound of a piano being tuned. The notes drifted through the partially open door, pure and crystalline in a way that his little keyboard could never replicate. Without thinking, he took a step forward, trying to hear better. "Whoa, hold up there," the guard said, blocking his path. "You're not going anywhere." But Marcus was transfixed. He'd only heard a real grand piano once before, during a school field trip to a concert hall, and the memory had haunted him ever since. The sound was so rich, so full of possibilities, that everything else faded away. "Is that a Steinway?" he asked softly, more to himself than to the guard. The guard stared at him in surprise. "How would you know about that?" Before Marcus could answer, Victoria Ashford appeared behind the guard, drawn by the commotion. She took one look at Marcus, his brown skin, his modest clothes, his obvious youth, and her expression turned cold. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "This kid says he's looking for someone named Maria," the guard explained. "Claims his grandmother was supposed to work tonight." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "There's no Maria working tonight. All our staff came through the proper agency." She looked at Marcus with suspicion. "What are you really doing here?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm telling the truth. My grandmother Dorothy Johnson works for Premier Catering sometimes, and Premier Catering isn't working this event," Victoria cut him off. "We use exclusive services only." The implication hung in the air, that Marcus and his grandmother weren't good enough for this level of society. Marcus felt the familiar sting of being judged by his appearance, his age, his address. But the piano music still called to him, each note a siren song that made his fingers itch to play. "I must have gotten the address wrong," he said quietly, taking a step back. "I'm sorry to bother you." But as he turned to leave, another cascade of notes poured from the mansion, and Marcus couldn't help but pause. His head tilted slightly as he listened, his trained ear picking up the subtle variations in tone and technique. Victoria noticed his hesitation and mistook it for something more sinister. "Are you casing the house?" she accused. "Planning to come back later?" "No, ma'am," Marcus said quickly. I've never heard a piano like that before." His honesty only seemed to make Victoria more suspicious. In her world, people didn't just appreciate fine things, they either owned them or they coveted them for the wrong reasons. A teenage boy from the wrong side of town expressing interest in her expensive piano could only mean trouble. "Security," she called sharply. "Please escort this young man off the property immediately." More guards appeared, and Marcus found himself surrounded. The music stopped abruptly, and he could hear voices from inside, probably discussing the disturbance. He felt smaller than ever, an intruder in a world that would never welcome him. But as he was being led away, Marcus caught a glimpse through the open door of the most beautiful piano he'd ever seen. Its black lacquer surface gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and its keys seemed to glow with invitation. For just a moment, he imagined what it would feel like to sit at that bench, to make music on an instrument worthy of the dreams he carried. The fantasy lasted only seconds before the door closed firmly behind him, leaving him standing on the sidewalk outside the mansion's gates. But the image of that piano would stay with him, and the music he'd heard would echo in his mind long into the night. What Marcus didn't know was that his brief encounter had been noticed by more than just security, and that his story was far from over. Richard Steinberg had paused mid-performance when the commotion at the entrance became impossible to ignore. His perfectly manicured fingers hovered over the Steinway's keys as he watched Victoria handle what appeared to be some sort of security issue. When she returned to the living room, her face was flushed with irritation. "My apologies, everyone," Victoria announced to her guests. "Just a confused delivery person. These people sometimes get the wrong address and think they can simply walk into private events." Richard's curiosity was piqued, not by sympathy but by a mixture of amusement and superiority. "What kind of person mistakes a charity gala for a delivery stop?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Some teenager," Victoria replied, waving her hand dismissively. "Claimed his grandmother was supposed to work tonight. The audacity of these people never ceases to amaze me." Helena Worthington leaned forward with interest. Was he trying to get inside? How frightening. "The strangest part," Victoria continued, her voice taking on a mocking tone, "was that he seemed fascinated by the piano. As if he had any idea what he was looking at." Richard raised an eyebrow, his interest shifting from mild amusement to outright derision. In his world, musical appreciation was earned through proper education, expensive lessons, and social connections. The idea that some random teenager from the wrong side of town could have any genuine understanding of classical music was absurd. "Probably saw it in a movie," Richard said with a laugh that his audience eagerly echoed. "These kids today think they understand art because they've watched a few YouTube videos." "Should we call the police?" asked Margaret Chen, another prominent socialite. "Young people like that sometimes come back." Victoria was about to respond when one of her security guards approached discreetly. "Ma'am, the young man is still outside. He hasn't left the area, he's just standing by the gates." "Still here?" Victoria's voice rose in indignation. "What is he doing?" "He appears to be listening to the piano music, ma'am." This revelation sent a ripple of laughter through the assembled guests. The image of some street kid pressing his face against the gates to hear classical music struck them as simultaneously pathetic and presumptuous. Richard stood up from the piano bench, an idea forming in his mind that pleased him immensely. "You know what, Victoria? I think we should invite him in." The room fell silent. Victoria stared at him in shock. "Excuse me?" "Think about it," Richard continued, his smile growing wider and more malicious. "Here we are, raising money for underprivileged youth, and we have one right outside our door. Wouldn't it be educational to show him what real music sounds like?" "Richard, I hardly think," Victoria began, but Richard was already warming to his theme. "We could ask him to play something," Richard suggested, his voice dripping with false generosity. "I'm sure he thinks he has talent. It would be amusing to see what passes for musical education in his environment." The cruelty of the suggestion was obvious to everyone, which made it all the more appealing to guests who rarely had opportunities to feel superior so directly. They began to murmur their agreement, their charitable evening taking on a more entertaining dimension. "It would certainly put things in perspective," agreed Helena. "Show the difference between real musical training and whatever these children pick up from popular culture." Victoria found herself caught between her instinct to maintain exclusivity and her desire to please her distinguished guest. Richard Steinberg was, after all, the evening's main attraction, and if he wanted to make a point about the value of proper musical education, who was she to object? "I suppose it could be instructive," she said slowly. "Exactly," Richard said, returning to the piano with renewed energy. "We'll invite him in, let him try to play something, and then I'll demonstrate what years of proper training can accomplish. Consider it a master class in the importance of supporting real music education." The guests were now fully invested in this new entertainment. Phones were discreetly pulled out, ready to capture what was sure to be an amusing moment of a teenager's humiliation. The charity gala had suddenly become much more interesting. "Very well," Victoria decided. "But we do this properly. He'll play first, then Richard will show us all what real musicianship looks like." As the security guard went to fetch Marcus, Richard sat back down at the piano, his confidence absolute. He'd been performing for decades, had won Grammys, had played for presidents and royalty. Whatever this kid thought he could do would only serve to highlight Richard's own superior skill and training. What Richard didn't anticipate was that sometimes, talent comes from the most unexpected places, and that his cruel joke was about to become something else entirely. Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing when the security guard approached him outside the gates. "Mrs. Ashford would like to invite you inside," the man said, though his tone suggested he thought the whole idea was ridiculous. "Inside?" Marcus repeated, his heart racing. "Are you sure?" "The pianist wants to meet you," the guard explained, though he left out the cruel intentions behind the invitation. "Something about music education." Marcus followed the guard through the mansion's front entrance, his eyes wide as he took in the marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and artwork that probably cost more than his entire neighborhood. The opulence was overwhelming, but what drew his attention most was the sound of conversation punctuated by laughter that seemed to grow louder as he approached. When he entered the main living room, the conversation stopped abruptly. 30 pairs of eyes turned to examine him, and Marcus felt like a specimen under a microscope. He was acutely aware of his simple clothes, his youth, his difference from everyone in the room. Victoria stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Everyone, this is the young man I mentioned. He seemed very interested in our piano." More chuckles rippled through the crowd. Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks as he realized he was being displayed like some sort of curiosity. But then his gaze fell on the Steinway, and everything else faded away. It was even more beautiful up close, a work of art that promised sounds he'd only dreamed of. Richard Steinberg rose from the piano bench with theatrical grace. "So you're the young man who appreciates fine music," he said, his tone carrying a mockery that Marcus was too nervous to fully register. "I'm Richard Steinberg. Perhaps you've heard of me?" Marcus nodded quickly. Of course he knew who Richard Steinberg was. He'd watched countless videos of the man's performances, had studied his technique, had tried to emulate his interpretations on his little keyboard. "Yes, sir. I've seen your recording of the Chopin ballades. They're incredible." This unexpected knowledge caused a brief moment of surprise, but Richard quickly recovered. If anything, it made his plan more delicious. The kid apparently knew enough to be truly humiliated. "How wonderful," Richard said with false warmth. "Then you'll appreciate what we're about to do. These lovely people have gathered tonight to support music education for underprivileged youth. I thought it would be educational for you to show us what you can do at the piano." The trap was set, and Marcus walked right into it. His eyes lit up with an excitement that made some of the guests shift uncomfortably. There was something genuine about his enthusiasm that didn't match their expectations of how this should unfold. "You want me to play?" Marcus asked, hardly believing it. "Oh yes," Victoria chimed in, her phone already recording. "We'd love to see what you can do with a real instrument." Marcus approached the piano with reverence that was almost religious. He'd dreamed of this moment, sitting at a real grand piano, feeling the weight of proper keys under his fingers, hearing the rich resonance that only a quality instrument could provide. "What would you like me to play?" he asked, settling onto the bench and adjusting its height with practiced ease, a detail that went unnoticed by the audience but would have meant something to a real musician. "Whatever you'd like," Richard said generously, stepping back to give the crowd a better view. "Play something that shows us what you've learned." The guests pressed closer, phones raised, expecting to capture a moment of teenage foolishness that they could share later as evidence of their superiority. They were prepared for wrong notes, poor technique, maybe a simple melody played with the awkwardness of amateur enthusiasm. Marcus took a deep breath and placed his hands on the keys. The weight was different from his keyboard, substantial, responsive, alive. Even the silence before he began seemed richer, full of potential. "I'd like to play Bach's Invention No. 13, he said quietly, more to himself than to the audience. Richard's eyebrows rose slightly. It was an unusual choice, not flashy or immediately recognizable, but technically demanding and musically sophisticated. Still, he thought, the kid probably didn't realize how difficult it actually was. Marcus began to play, and the first notes that emerged from the Steinway were pure and perfect. His touch was confident, his fingering precise, his phrasing musical and mature. But more than technical proficiency, there was something else, a deep understanding of the music that went beyond mere note reading. The laughter in the room began to fade as the guests realized that what they were hearing wasn't the amateur fumbling they'd expected. This was real music, played with skill and sensitivity that belonged in a concert hall. Richard's confident smile began to waver as he recognized that this wasn't going according to plan at all. As Marcus's fingers moved across the Steinway's keys, something magical happened in Victoria Ashford's living room. The Bach invention that flowed from the piano wasn't just correct, it was inspired. Each voice in the counterpoint sang with clarity and purpose, the intricate lines weaving together in a tapestry of sound that silenced every skeptical murmur. Marcus was lost in the music, unaware of the stunned faces around him. For the first time in his life, he was playing an instrument that could match his musical imagination. Every subtle dynamic, every delicate phrasing, every moment of musical breathing that he'd practiced on his silent keyboard was finally given voice. The Steinway responded to his touch like a living thing, translating his emotions into sound with breathtaking fidelity. Helena Worthington lowered her phone, her mouth slightly open. This wasn't what she'd expected to record. Margaret Chin grabbed her husband's arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. Around the room, the collective assumption about what they were witnessing crumbled note by note. Richard Steinberg felt something cold settle in his stomach. As a professional musician, he could recognize quality when he heard it, and what Marcus was producing wasn't just competent, it was exceptional. The boy's technique was flawless, his musical understanding sophisticated, his interpretation mature beyond his years. These weren't the fumbling attempts of a self-taught amateur, this was the playing of someone with genuine talent and deep musical knowledge. But what disturbed Richard most was the pure joy emanating from Marcus as he played. It had been years since Richard had felt that kind of connection to music, his performances had become calculated displays of technical prowess designed to impress rather than express. Watching this teenager pour his soul into Bach with such obvious love for the music itself was like looking at a reflection of everything Richard had lost. Victoria stood frozen, her recording still running but her purpose for it completely transformed. She'd intended to capture a moment of amusing incompetence. Instead, she was documenting something that challenged everything she believed about talent, education, and social hierarchies. As Marcus moved into the more complex sections of the invention, his playing only grew more assured. His left hand maintained a steady foundation while his right hand danced through intricate passages with fluid grace. He navigated the piece's technical demands not with grim determination but with the ease of someone for whom this music was a natural language. The room had become cathedral quiet, broken only by the stream of perfect notes flowing from the piano. Some guests had put their phones away entirely, too transfixed to remember they'd intended to mock what they were witnessing. Others continued recording, but now their expressions showed wonder rather than cruel anticipation. Marcus reached the climactic passage where both hands engaged in rapid, interlocking scales. This was the section that separated amateur players from serious musicians, where technical skill and musical understanding had to combine seamlessly. On his keyboard at home, Marcus had practiced this passage hundreds of times, never quite achieving the effect he heard in his mind. Now, with the Steinway's full dynamic range at his disposal, the passage blazed with crystalline clarity. Each note rang true, each phrase built logically to the next, and the mathematical beauty of Bach's composition revealed itself in all its glory. It was a moment of musical truth that couldn't be faked or approximated. Richard found himself studying Marcus's hand position, his posture, his pedaling technique. Everything was textbook perfect, but more than that, it was musical. The boy wasn't just playing notes correctly, he was making them sing. Where had this training come from? Who had taught him to phrase Bach with such sophistication? As the invention approached its conclusion, Marcus allowed himself a small ritardando, a slight slowing that gave weight to the final cadence. It was a mature interpretive choice, the kind of musical decision that came from deep understanding rather than mere technical ability. The final chord resonated through the mansion with authority and finality. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus sat at the piano bench, his hands still poised over the keys, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. For a few precious minutes, he had experienced what it felt like to make real music on a real instrument, and the joy of it radiated from him like light. The guests stared in stunned silence, their worldview quietly reshaping itself around what they'd just witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Talent like this was supposed to come with the right background, the right education, the right social connections. It wasn't supposed to emerge from nowhere, carried by a teenager in second-hand clothes who'd wandered in from the wrong side of town. Richard cleared his throat, his planned demonstration suddenly feeling hollow and unnecessary. The cruel joke he'd intended had become something else entirely, a revelation that would change everyone in that room, starting with himself. Marcus finally lifted his hands from the piano keys and turned toward the audience, expecting to see the polite applause that usually followed musical performances. Instead, he found 30 faces staring at him in various states of shock, awe, and confusion. The silence stretched uncomfortably long, and Marcus began to worry that he'd done something wrong. I'm sorry if that wasn't what you wanted to hear, he said hesitantly. I could play something else. His words broke the spell, and suddenly everyone began talking at once. But instead of the mocking laughter Marcus had half expected, the conversations were urgent whispers of amazement. Did you hear that phrasing in the development section? Where did he learn to play like that? That was conservatory-level playing. Victoria Ashford found her voice first, though it came out smaller than usual. That was quite impressive, young man. Where did you study? Marcus looked confused by the question. Study? I haven't really studied anywhere. I mean, I watch videos online and practice at home. Videos? Richard interjected, his professional skepticism overriding his shock. You learned Bach from YouTube videos? Well, yes sir, Marcus replied, not understanding why this seemed so unbelievable. There are some really good tutorials, and I can slow them down to see the fingering. Plus I have some sheet music I downloaded from the library computer. The guests exchanged glances. This explanation was somehow more astounding than the performance itself. Self-taught musicians occasionally achieved competency, but what they'd just heard suggested years of high-level instruction. Helena Worthington stepped forward, her journalist instincts kicking in. What instrument do you practice on at home? Marcus's cheeks reddened slightly. It's just a small keyboard. Nothing like this. The keys don't have the same weight, and there's no sustain pedal, but I can practice the fingering patterns. A keyboard? Margaret Chen's voice rose in disbelief. You mean like a toy? It's not a toy, Marcus said quietly, suddenly defensive about his modest instrument. It's all we can afford. My grandmother works really hard, but piano lessons and a real piano, they're just not possible right now. The word grandmother hit the room like a physical force. Here was a teenager living with his grandmother, practicing on a cheap keyboard, learning from free online videos, and somehow achieving a level of musical excellence that most of their own children, with their expensive lessons and top-tier instruments, could never approach. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. His own musical education had cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, private lessons from master teachers, attendance at elite conservatories, access to the finest instruments money could buy. And yet this boy, with none of those advantages, had just delivered a performance that reminded Richard why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. How long have you been playing? Richard asked, his voice gentler than it had been all evening. About 6 years, Marcus replied. Since I was 8. My grandmother found the keyboard at a thrift store for my birthday. 6 years. Richard calculated quickly. Most of his conservatory classmates had been playing since they were 4 or 5, with daily lessons and constant parental pressure. This boy had achieved in 6 years what others struggled to accomplish in twice that time, and he'd done it entirely on his own initiative. "What else can you play?" Victoria asked, though her tone had completely changed from mocking to genuinely curious. Marcus brightened at the question. "I love Chopin. His nocturnes are beautiful, but I've only been able to practice them without the pedal effects. And some Mozart sonatas, though they're really hard to get right without proper touch sensitivity." The technical vocabulary flowed naturally from him: pedal effects, touch sensitivity, phrasing concepts that most amateur players never even encountered. This wasn't a kid who'd memorized a few party pieces, this was someone who understood music at a fundamental level. Richard made a decision that surprised even himself. "Would you play something else? Perhaps something by Chopin?" Marcus's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that made several guests smile despite themselves. "Could I? I mean, if you're sure." "I'm sure," Richard said, and realized he meant it. The cruel demonstration he'd planned was forgotten, replaced by genuine curiosity about the extent of this remarkable young man's abilities. Marcus turned back to the piano, his hands hovering over the keys as he considered his options. "I'd like to play the Nocturne in E-flat major, if that's okay. It's one of my favorites." As he began the opening melody, Richard closed his eyes and listened, really listened, for the first time in years. And what he heard was music in its purest form, not performance, not showmanship, but a young soul communicating through sound with honesty and beauty that left the entire room transformed. The opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major floated through the mansion like a gentle confession. Marcus's interpretation was intimate and personal, each phrase shaped with the kind of emotional maturity that couldn't be taught in any classroom. The melody sang with yearning and hope, speaking directly to hearts that had forgotten what it meant to truly listen to music. When the final notes faded away, the silence was even more profound than before. Victoria found herself blinking back tears she couldn't explain, while Richard stood completely still, overwhelmed by memories of why he'd wanted to become a musician in the first place. "That was extraordinary," Richard said finally, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "Marcus, you have a gift that, well, it's remarkable." Marcus smiled shyly. "Thank you, sir. Music is kind of everything to me. When I play, it's like I can express things I don't have words for." "How did you first know you wanted to play piano?" Helena asked, her phone now forgotten in her purse. Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. "My parents died when I was 7, he said simply, causing a collective intake of breath around the room. "My grandmother Dorothy took me in, and she was working so much just to keep us going. I felt lost and angry and sad all the time. Then one day, she brought home this little keyboard from a thrift store." He paused, his fingers absently touching the Steinway's keys. "She said music might help me find a way to deal with my feelings. The first time I pressed a key and heard a note, it was like I'd found a language I'd been looking for my whole life." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the narrative she'd constructed about underprivileged youth needing guidance to become productive members of society. This was a young man who had found his own path to healing and expression, despite circumstances that would have crushed many adults. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman," Richard said softly. "She is," Marcus replied, his voice full of love and gratitude. "She works double shifts at the hospital cafeteria sometimes, just so we can keep our apartment. She's never complained, not once, even though I know she's tired. And she always encourages my music, even though she knows it's not practical." "What do you mean, not practical?" Margaret Chen asked. Marcus shrugged. "Well, people like me don't usually become professional musicians. We don't have the connections or the money for the right schools. My grandmother wants me to have realistic goals." The casual acceptance in his voice was devastating. Here was a teenager with obvious genius-level talent who had already internalized the message that his dreams were unrealistic because of his circumstances. "That's ridiculous," Richard said with sudden force, surprising everyone including himself. Talent like yours doesn't care about backgrounds or bank accounts. Music is music. But it's expensive, isn't it? Marcus asked innocently. Lessons and real instruments in music schools. My grandmother looked into piano lessons once, but even the cheapest ones were more than our grocery budget. The number hit the room like a physical blow. These people had spent more on tonight's flowers than this family spent on food, yet here was this remarkable young man apologizing for not being able to afford things they took for granted. Victoria thought about her own children, who had access to every musical opportunity money could buy but who showed no particular talent or passion. The irony was bitter and undeniable. Marcus, Richard said carefully, what would you want to do if money wasn't an obstacle? The boy's eyes lit up with a dream he rarely allowed himself to voice. I'd love to study music seriously. Maybe learn composition. I've been trying to write some pieces, but I don't really know the theory. And I'd want to perform someday, not for money necessarily, but just to share music with people who love it the way I do. You compose? Victoria asked in amazement. I try to, Marcus admitted. Nothing very good. Just little melodies and things. I write them down on staff paper I print at the library. Richard felt his worldview continuing to crumble. This teenager was not only a gifted performer but also a composer, working entirely without guidance or support, driven by pure passion for music. It put Richard's own carefully managed career into stark perspective. Would you play something you've written? Richard asked. Marcus hesitated. It's not very polished. And I've only been able to hear it on my keyboard, so I don't know how it'll sound on a real piano. Please, said Helena, speaking for the entire room. We'd love to hear it. Marcus positioned his hands over the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play something entirely his own. The piece was simple but moving, a melody that spoke of longing and hope, of dreams held carefully in young hands. It wasn't technically complex, but it had something more important, it had heart. As the last notes faded away, Richard knew that everything had changed. This wasn't about charity or social hierarchies or proving points about privilege. This was about recognizing extraordinary talent and doing whatever it took to nurture it. The evening had become something none of them had expected, and there was no going back. The original composition still echoed in the room when Richard Steinberg did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He remembered who he used to be. Before the fame, before the ego, before the carefully constructed persona of musical superiority, he had been a young man who simply loved music. Marcus's original piece, imperfect but achingly sincere, had stripped away decades of pretension and reminded Richard of that forgotten self. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard said, his voice carrying a gravity that commanded attention, I owe you all an apology. But more importantly, I owe Marcus an apology. The room stirred uneasily. This wasn't following the script anyone had expected. When I suggested bringing Marcus inside, Richard continued, it wasn't out of kindness or genuine interest in music education. It was cruel entertainment. I wanted to humiliate him to make myself feel superior. Victoria felt her cheeks burn as she realized her own complicity in the plan. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, recognizing their own eager participation in what they now understood had been intended as cruelty. Instead, Richard said, looking directly at Marcus, you've given us something extraordinary. You've reminded us what music actually is, not a commodity or a status symbol, but a language of the heart. And you've done it with more grace and talent than I've shown in years. Marcus looked confused by the apology. I don't understand, Mr. Steinberg. You've been very kind to let me play. The innocence in his response made Richard's shame even deeper. Marcus, I invited you to play because I thought you would embarrass yourself. I wanted these people to laugh at you. The truth hung in the air like a physical weight. Marcus processed this information slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to hurt to something else, a kind of sad understanding that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with such cruelty. Oh, he said quietly. I see. But what happened instead, Richard continued urgently, is that you showed us all what real artistry looks like. You've been practicing on a broken keyboard, learning from library computers, and you've achieved something that most professional musicians spend decades trying to reach. Helena Worthington found herself stepping forward. Richard's right, Marcus. What we heard tonight, it was extraordinary. And what we intended. She shook her head, unable to finish the sentence. Victoria knew she had to speak, though the words felt like glass in her throat. Marcus, I want to apologize as well. I made assumptions about you based on things that have nothing to do with who you are or what you're capable of. That was wrong of me. Around the room, other guests began to murmur their own apologies and expressions of amazement. The energy had completely shifted from condescension to genuine respect and admiration. But Marcus surprised them all with his response. It's okay, he said simply. I understand. People make assumptions sometimes. What matters is that you let me play this beautiful piano. That's more than I ever expected. His grace in the face of their revealed cruelty was devastating. Here was a young man who had every right to be angry, to call out their prejudice and meanness, and instead he was grateful for the opportunity they'd given him, even knowing it had been offered in bad faith. Richard felt something fundamental shift inside him. Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Would you allow me to help you with your musical education? Help me how? Marcus asked cautiously. Piano lessons. Theory instruction. Access to proper instruments. Help applying to music programs. Whatever it takes to nurture the incredible talent you have. Marcus stared at him in disbelief. You would do that? But why? Because talent like yours doesn't come along often, Richard replied. And because I spent 20 years forgetting why music matters. You reminded me in 20 minutes. Victoria stepped forward, her voice stronger now. I'd like to help too. The foundation I run could provide financial support for your education. It would be an honor. I don't understand, Marcus said, looking around the room in bewilderment. Why would you want to help me? Because, said Helena, speaking for all of them, tonight you showed us that excellence doesn't depend on privilege. It depends on passion and dedication and love for what you do. And you have all of those things in abundance. Marcus felt tears prick at his eyes. I'd have to talk to my grandmother. She's very proud, and she might not want to accept charity. It wouldn't be charity, Richard said firmly. It would be an investment in musical excellence. And Marcus? You'd be doing us the favor, not the other way around. You'd be letting us be part of something beautiful. As the evening wound down and practical arrangements began to be discussed, Richard pulled Marcus aside. Can I ask you one more thing? Of course, sir. When you were playing tonight, what were you thinking about? Marcus considered the question seriously. I was thinking about how lucky I am, he said finally. To have found something I love so much, to have a grandmother who supports me, and to be in a room full of people who care about music. Even if it was just for one night. Richard felt his eyes fill with tears he hadn't shed in decades. This remarkable young man, faced with intended humiliation, had found gratitude. Offered genuine opportunities, he worried about his grandmother's pride. Given a chance to perform on a world-class instrument, he focused on the joy of making music rather than the opportunity for personal advancement. Marcus, Richard said softly, you're going to change the world with your music. And tonight, you've already started by changing mine. 3 months later, Marcus Johnson sat at the Steinway in Richard Steinberg's private studio, working through a particularly challenging passage from a Rachmaninoff prelude. His technique had evolved remarkably under Richard's guidance, but more importantly, his confidence had blossomed. The shy teenager who had stumbled into the charity gala was becoming a young artist with genuine presence and authority. Better, Richard said from his position by the window. But remember, the melody needs to sing above the accompaniment. Don't let the left hand overwhelm the musical line. Marcus nodded and played the passage again, this time with the perfect balance Richard had been teaching him. The improvement was immediate and obvious. Excellent, Richard smiled. You're ready for the audition. The Juilliard pre-college audition was scheduled for the following week. Through Richard's connections and a scholarship program that Victoria's Foundation had expanded specifically to support exceptional students from underserved communities, Marcus would have the opportunity to study with some of the world's finest teachers. I'm nervous, Marcus admitted, closing the music score. Good, Richard replied. Nerves mean you care. But remember what you've learned about channeling that energy into your performance. The past 3 months had been transformative for both student and teacher. Richard had rediscovered his passion for music through the joy of sharing it with someone who approached every lesson with genuine enthusiasm. Marcus had grown not just as a musician but as a young man, gaining confidence that extended far beyond the piano. Dorothy Johnson arrived to pick up her grandson, as she did every Tuesday and Thursday. Her relationship with Richard had been cautious at first, she was suspicious of Charity and protective of Marcus's dignity. But Richard's genuine respect for her grandson and his commitment to treating their arrangement as a mentorship rather than charity had gradually won her trust. How did he do today? She asked Richard, as she always did. See for yourself, Richard replied, gesturing toward Marcus. Play the Chopin for your grandmother. Marcus launched into the Ballade No. 1, a piece far more complex than anything he'd been able to attempt 3 months earlier. His interpretation was mature and confident, showing not just technical mastery but deep musical understanding. Dorothy listened with tears in her eyes, still amazed by the opportunities that had opened up for her grandson. Beautiful, baby, she said when he finished. Your parents would be so proud. Victoria Ashford arrived just as Marcus was packing up his music. She'd become a regular visitor to these lessons, finding genuine fulfillment in supporting Marcus's development in a way that felt meaningful rather than performative. Ready for New York? She asked Marcus. I think so, he replied, though his nervousness was obvious. Remember, Victoria said, you belong in that audition room. Talent like yours isn't a fluke or an accident. It's a gift that deserves to be nurtured at the highest level. As they prepared to leave, Richard pulled Marcus aside for a final word of encouragement. Whatever happens at Juilliard, remember that music is about communication, not competition. Trust your preparation, trust your instincts, and trust the music itself. Marcus nodded, then surprised Richard with a hug. Thank you, he said simply. For everything. After they left, Richard sat alone at his piano, thinking about how much had changed since that evening at Victoria's gala. He'd begun performing again with renewed passion, his playing infused with the emotional honesty that Marcus had reminded him was possible. More importantly, he'd started a scholarship program to identify and support other young musicians who might otherwise be overlooked. The phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Helena Worthington, calling with news about a young violinist in Detroit whose talent had been discovered through their expanded outreach program. Another one? Richard asked, smiling. Another one, Helena confirmed. When can you get to Michigan? As Richard looked at his calendar, planning another trip to evaluate another young musician, he reflected on how a single evening of intended cruelty had become a catalyst for change. Marcus had not only transformed his own life through talent and perseverance but had transformed everyone around him through grace and determination. The boy who had wandered into the wrong world at the wrong time had turned out to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, not just for himself, but for everyone who had the privilege of witnessing his gift. The music continued, as it always does, finding new voices to carry it forward into the future. Dear friend, this story reminds us that extraordinary talent can emerge from the most unexpected places, regardless of background or circumstances. Marcus's journey shows us that true excellence isn't about privilege or access, it's about passion, dedication, and the courage to pursue your dreams despite obstacles. But equally important is how witnessing genuine talent transformed everyone around Marcus, teaching them to look beyond surface judgments and recognize the potential in every person they meet. We all have the power to either nurture or dismiss the talents we encounter. The next time you meet someone different from yourself, remember that they might be carrying gifts the world desperately needs to hear. Every act of encouragement matters, every opportunity shared can change a life. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales that celebrate the human spirit.